Really happy to be with folks today, and we're going to have an interesting conversation, I hope, about alternatives to policing and what the systemic harm is to trans and queer folks, and how we can do some things a little bit differently to hopefully make the world better for trans and queer folks. Thank you for inviting me to be here with you all today, especially to Sky and Ayana and Nick and Carmen, who are on the back end of things today. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today is I will give you a brief snapshot about who Forge is, the organization that I work for. We'll look at what we've been taught about policing. We'll then talk about the outdated thinking that we might have around policing and sharing that with some statistics that affect trans people and the violence and victimization rates around trans folks and how that relates to policing. We'll talk a little bit about cultural awakening and what's been happening in our world to, hopefully change the narrative a little bit about how we look at policing and what happens in our world. And then we'll end with some interaction around how we can have some alternatives to policing that may be more humane and more appropriate to treat people the way that is respectful and actually gets people the services that they need. I oftentimes don't do content warnings or content sensitivities, but I do know that this topic in particular can be really very sensitive for many of us. So the content warnings, and these are just a few of the things that may be sensitive, are we'll talk about police today, as the title suggests. We'll talk a little bit about some violence statistics, which are sometimes hard to hear. We'll talk very briefly about suicide and depression, and we'll talk about systemic harm. So hopefully we won't go into anything in depth that's going to be triggering to folks, but I know that with triggers that people can get easily moored or unmoored by some of these topics. So I really want to remind folks to take care of yourself. If you've been on a Forge training before, you've seen this slide, but it's really a reminder to all of us to take care of ourselves. And if that means stepping away from your computer, whatever that means for you to do, please take care of yourself. We will have a few moments of interaction today, and I would love it if people interacted, but I also know that sometimes that makes it more difficult, and that's not part of everyone's caretaking. Let me give you a little bit of a snapshot about who Forge is. We have been around for 27 years. We are a trans organization that is 100% focused on anti-violence issues. We predominantly train victim service providers and other allied professionals, and about 25% of our work is directly with trans and non-binary survivors and loved ones. Our work is national in scope, but we do have some local programming here where I am in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So we do some work throughout Wisconsin as well as nationally. Just a brief snapshot too about some of the work that we do with providers. We do a lot of training and technical assistance. I'm our primary trainer, and some of our other staff do training as well. We have quite a few publications and trainings that are available on our website that are archived and free and easy to download and take a look at. Before COVID, we did lots of conferences, and I personally miss going to places and seeing other people and being in those spaces with folks. But we do conferences when that is safe to do. We also do webinars like this one, as well as create some of our own webinars to put on. We do some site visits for folks who want to increase their capacity to serve trans folks better. And we're also involved with some policy and collaborative efforts to, again, make the world better for trans and non-binary survivors. All of the work that we do is really centered around two guiding principles, the first of which is to be trauma-informed, and the second is to be empowerment-based. So I'm hoping that those things draw through today, and you'll see those pieces working through. I hope that you don't leave feeling depressed and unempowered or traumatized. So if you do, I have not done my job, and I would welcome your feedback on that. But we do care about staying up to date on trauma-informed theories, as well as making sure that we encourage the resilience and the empowerment and the self-agency that folks have. Our world is driven by social media for most of us, except for those of us who possibly get banned from social media. But we encourage all of you to find us on social media. We are on multiple platforms, so Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So that is definitely the way that we share information, and we love to hear what other people are doing as well. So that's a little bit about Forge. I wanted to tell you very, very briefly a little bit about who I am. I made this word cloud a couple of days ago, and it has some of the words that embody me, but I mostly wanted to share with you that I am not an expert on law enforcement or police reform. What I do excel at is being hopefully a good trainer, being trauma informed, being pro empowerment, being trans focused, being focused around sexual assault and intimate partner violence and hate motivated crimes, being focused on harm reduction and caring for the safety of folks, and trying to start and initiate conversations that are critical and move the ball forward, even though I don't do sports. So hopefully we will move the ball forward a little bit for all of us today in the conversations that we have and the presentation that we go through this afternoon. So I'm going to encourage us to interact in 3 different ways today. So one of which is the chat, which I'm sure that all of us are familiar with Zoom and know where the chat is. So that's one way that we're going to interact. A second way is through polls. We'll have 2 of those. And then the third way is going to be a fun mind mapping activity through Google Draw. So if you're able to access a web browser, I will ask you all to find your web browser later in the presentation, and we will all create a map together. So we've been taught a lot of things. And so I just want to briefly talk a little bit about what some of that history is that most of us bring into this conversation. Almost all of us have been taught from our parents and public officials in our schools and just about everywhere that we should call 911 when there's a problem, that we should if we're ever having a conflict with our neighbors, or if we hear loud noises, or whatever it is, we're supposed to call 911. That is like the underlying message that we get growing up and we get as adults. And I challenge us to think of this from the very beginning about what this means when we're taught to call 911 and how disempowering that can be, and how we may have better solutions that actually don't cause harm. And we're going to talk about how calling 911 and engaging police can be harmful for folks. So I'd like to start out with a chat. So if folks can find that chat box, and I'd like you to think about, where do you hear the messages about calling 911? So when you are moving through your day, where do you hear, if this is an emergency, call 911? What do folks think? I'll give us a starter prompt. When I call in my prescriptions, I always hear, if this is a medical emergency, call 911. So yeah, people are saying doctor's offices, voicemail from healthcare providers, school, in case of a fire, doctor's offices, yep. What are some other places? Emails from healthcare providers, teachers. Parental prompts, work, commercials, exactly, billboards, emergency signage, radio, utilities, healthcare flyers, CPR emergencies, logging into healthcare apps. Exactly. Weather emergencies, yeah. Those are great examples. TV shows, emergency responders themselves. Perfect. Those are great. If you want to keep on going, that's perfect. So yeah, you all mentioned some of the main places. So around healthcare, we hear it if we have a therapist and we call to leave a message. We oftentimes hear that, call 911 if we're calling our mental health provider. Around our doctor's offices and doctor's visits, we hear things like see something, say something. Around if we see something at an airport, we're supposed to call in. Maybe it's not 911, but it's recommended that we call in and do something. Like many of you have mentioned, there are TV or media that recommend that we call 911 as well. And I would encourage us to think about the fact that a lot of times when we only have one tool, that's the only tool that we use. So my dad used to talk about how when you have a hammer and a nail in your toolbox, that's the only thing that you know how to do. So, you treat everything like a hammer and you treat everything like a nail, and that's how it goes. So I want us to think today about all of the other tools that we have in our toolboxes. So hammers are great, nails are great, but they don't work for everything that is appropriate. All of the needs that we might have around mental health, about substance use, about homelessness, about resolving conflict. That hammer and that nail are not necessarily going to work in all of those cases. So as a culture, we continue to use and oftentimes use over and over and over again that same hammer and that same nail, even when that hammer is old, when it's rusty, when the nails are bent. We sometimes kind of keep on doing the same thing because we don't have an alternative. So let's look at some of those other tools and some of the other things that we can do. So the hammer and the nail and the 911 and the calling police are some of the outdated thinking that we oftentimes carry forward. It's, as people have mentioned in the chat, it's what we're taught as kids in school. It's what we're taught by our parents, if we have parents. It's what's taught by coaches or faith leaders or people that are in our social sphere or in our culture. So let's talk about why calling the cops might not be the best thing. So we know that calling the police is sometimes doing more harm than good. So police have a long history of saying, hey, we don't have the skills to address many of the situations that we're being called to address. So a lot of police are not trained or not trained very well in things like intimate partner violence or mental health crises, or how to deal with somebody who's having a manic episode or is highly intoxicated. Those are things that law enforcement may not have the best skills to know how to handle. Calling the police can also increase the level of harm that some people experience. So if police, for example, come and they talk about, they come to address an intimate partner violence situation, and they end up leaving without any resolution to that intimate partner violence interaction, that may actually increase the amount of harm that's going to happen after the police leave. So we can see that sometimes police are trying to be helpful, but what ends up happening is that their involvement, especially if they get involved and then they don't take any additional actions to proactively help somebody, it can cause additional levels of harm. So it can be with substance use, it can be with victimization, it can be with lots of different things. There is also a lack of understanding of a wide variety of cultures within law enforcement. So law enforcement have oftentimes like 10-minute trainings on different populations and may not know about queer people, about trans people, about people with disabilities. They may not understand cultures based on race or ethnicity or any of those different kinds of things, because what they get trained are these little teeny segments. So that lack of understanding may add to where more harm is caused. And oftentimes law enforcement have a one-size-fits-all model. So there's a heavy focus for law enforcement on following policies and protocols and doing things in a specific way. And I want to remind us all, we know this, that people are messy, people are complicated, and people oftentimes don't fit into neat policies or neat protocols. So when law enforcement comes in and they're trying to do what they're supposed to do, which they've been trained to do, the people don't necessarily fit into that policy or procedure of what those law enforcement officers are doing. So let's look a little bit at framing some of these issues. And I'm going to share some stats with you just to kind of help us get a better sense of who we're talking about and the harm that it can be caused by law enforcement. So first of all, let's just recognize that people, again, are complex. None of us has one identity or one set of experiences. We have a level of interconnectedness or intersectionality, pick your word, multiple marginalizations, multiple experiences. And we can look at things like, we can examine how sex and gender intersect with things like race and ethnicity, with religion or age or disability, with geography, if we're living in a rural area, an urban area, on the coasts or in the Midwest, our culture, and the culture could be a whole bunch of different things. It could be intersecting with our income or our education or our sexual orientation, or many, many other attributes or qualities or experiences or identities. So when we're looking at issues of policing and reform and harm, all of these interconnected realities, we need to pay attention to those, because there are systems that are in place that have increased people's personal risk and people's personal harm. There are systems that have increased the likelihood of police interaction. So sometimes, we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but things like homelessness may increase somebody's likelihood of having an interaction with a law enforcement officer. There are also systems in place that increase the potential for police violence, and we'll talk about that as well. So I'd like to pull up poll number one, which is, the question is, do you know someone who has had a negative interaction with law enforcement? So yes, no, or unsure. So this could be you or somebody else, anybody in your world. So have you or someone else had a negative interaction with law enforcement? I'm just going to give folks a few seconds to respond. Excellent. I appreciate everybody sharing. So hopefully you can see on the screen that the majority of you, 56%, have said yes, that you have had, or somebody that you know has had a negative interaction. About 15% of you don't know. So I'm thrilled for the 30% that have had either positive interactions or don't know of anybody that have had negative interactions. So thank you for participating with that. So let me share with you a couple of stats around law enforcement and negative interactions. The U.S. Trans Survey, conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality in 2015, had a survey response rate of almost 28,000 trans and non-binary folks. So an incredibly large sample size. And some of the things that they asked people were around what their experiences were like with law enforcement. So for those of you who can see the screen, they found that there were only 43% of folks that never had a problem with interacting with police. I shouldn't say only, but that's a fair amount of folks. But for the always, or sorry, for the sometimes and the never, which equals 57%, there were negative interactions that happened with law enforcement. And let's look at a couple of ways that negative interaction plays out. So many times law enforcement ask invasive questions that are about somebody's transness, which has absolutely nothing to do with why law enforcement is called. So somebody might be in a car accident and law enforcement are asking about somebody's trans identity, their hormones, their surgery, other invasive questions. Almost half the time, trans folks are experiencing law enforcement using the wrong pronoun. So that can be a really big issue in terms of building trust. I mean, a lot of folks are not going to feel very trusting if they're being interacted with somebody who's not using their correct name or their correct pronoun. What's on the bottom of the slide is a little bit, I think, more potent in a lot of ways, which is how much police negative interaction directly is happening around sexual assault, physical assault, or verbal harassment. And the numbers here are actually lower than many other surveys that show, like, for example, sexual assault is in the 6 to 9% range for law enforcement against trans folks. Any amount of sexual assault by law enforcement is unacceptable. So any place from 3% to 9% in our data that we have available is pretty darn high and makes people less likely to want to engage with law enforcement or fearful to engage with law enforcement if someone else calls the police. A third statistic about police and negative interactions is around the folks who have been arrested. So around 2% of the population had been arrested in the survey that the National Center for Transgender Equality did. And of that 2%, 22% believed they were arrested because they were trans. So sometimes folks in the trans community talk about this as walking while trans. So a lot of times officers will think that trans women in particular, or trans women of color, who are walking down the street, if they get clocked by officers as being trans, they will often get arrested for sex work, even though that person is probably just walking down the street minding their own business. So that's a challenge that folks face when they're just walking out in the world and fearful of what's going to happen if law enforcement sees them moving about in the world. So why are there negative interactions with police? So as you can see from the prior slides, there are many well-documented reasons that trans folks and other marginalized populations might be fearful of some or maybe all police. Many of us know that there are histories of abusive practices and violence by law enforcement and unfair policing, unjust incarcerations, and just a few of those pieces can really lead people to feel really uncomfortable with law enforcement and really disempowered by those interactions. And we know that there are some systemic problems. Those are systemic problems, and they're historic problems. The practices with policing go back as far as we know, and some of those things have not changed, even though we've tried to get better, in our country at least, with policing. And I think we have a long way to go, as many of us recognize. So let me share some stats on homelessness. So again, from the same survey, large survey response rate, 30% of trans folks experienced homelessness at some point in their life. 26% of folks avoided shelter out of fear of mistreatment. So not 26% of the 30%, but 26% of this general population of trans folks taking this survey. So they avoided shelter for fear of mistreatment. For those people that did seek shelter of some form, 7 out of 10 were mistreated. So again, that shows some of the systemic issues that happen with our systems around homelessness and our systems of sheltering folks. Again, you're going to see the word systemic a lot today. And I want to point out that trans people are not like more likely, genetically or out of the womb more likely to become homeless. But there are variables and factors that lead people to becoming homeless, like being bullied at school, getting kicked out of the home at an early age, job discrimination or not being able to get a job, housing discrimination. Many of those kinds of things can lead people to being homeless. And so if trans people are not treated well in shelters, they are not likely going to seek shelters. They're going to likely be homeless or couch surfing or finding other ways to survive that will keep them as safe as they can possibly be, even if they don't have their own roof over their head. So again, there's some systemic issues that we have in our culture with homelessness and what that means. And I really do think that it ends up being that we value some people more than we value others. So when we look at this kind of trajectory that we're talking about, if we look at people that are homeless, we can look at people that are engaging in street economy work. And street economy generally translates to sex work, selling drugs or other things on the down low or on the street, or in some ways that are not reported on a W-2 to the IRS. So about 20% of the respondents in this, again, really large survey, said that they had participated in the underground economy. 12%, so of that whole response rate, engaged in sex for money. Which is a substantially higher number than around 1% of the population, the general population, who engage for sex for money. Of that 12% who engage in sex for money, 86% were harassed or attacked, sexually assaulted, or mistreated by law enforcement. So we know that people that are engaging in sex work oftentimes have high contact with law enforcement because in our country, in almost every city, it's illegal to do sex work. We can argue about whether that should be true or not, but it is illegal in most places, and people are experiencing very negative interactions from law enforcement, as well as in their interaction doing sex work itself. So again, why are we talking about street economy? How does this relate to policing? There's a system that creates this process where people are getting harmed by law enforcement and by others. Again, there's widespread anti-trans employment discrimination. There are young people getting kicked out of their homes. All of those things that we talked about with homelessness are going to translate into folks finding a way to survive. And finding a way to survive might be on the streets. It might be as creative as folks need to be to get to the place that they can have food and they can have shelter of some form. I do want to point out that a lot of times this shows the survival and the resilience of trans communities. So even when there's a lot of negative things happening in their life that may make it difficult to survive, they're finding a way to survive in some way, even though it's tough. When we look at rates of intimate partner violence, trans folks are experiencing intimate partner violence at a 50% rate, which is higher than other general populations. So this is pretty well reported. Williams Institute and many other surveys have found that it's about 50% of trans populations that are experiencing intimate partner violence. And once again, like I want to remind folks that trans people are not more inherently like destined to be in relationships that are abusive, but there's a system that happens that might enable people to enter into relationships that are more abusive. Trans people are oftentimes taught from an early age that nobody's going to love you, or this is as good as it gets. You can't expect more of a partner. They have to like put up with your transness. They're not going to do anything else. So you have to deal with abusiveness. So a lot of those messages result in trans folks entering relationships and staying in those relationships, even when they're abusive. So again, we can look at things like power over versus connection with. And as a culture, we have a lot of this as well. So it's not just trans folks, obviously, that are engaging in relationships and staying in relationships that are abusive, because that's part of the system of our culture, and not um, enhancing and promoting good communication, healthy communication, direct dialogue. And a lot of times, many people end up in abusive relationships from lack of skills. And that is definitely a systemic problem that we have in our culture. And there's some added layers then when we look at trans folks. So poll number 2, if you could pull that up, I'd appreciate it. Poll number 2 is, do you know someone who has been suicidal? So that could be, have you been suicidal, or do you know someone who's been suicidal? And if folks could vote in that poll, I'd appreciate it. And I'll just give folks a few seconds to respond. Excellent. And if you're able to see the screen, you can see that 75% of you do know someone, or you yourself have been suicidal, with less than 25% being a no or an unsure. So thank you for sharing that. And I think that this is what I expected to see in this poll, that many of us know someone who's been suicidal, or we ourselves have experienced those feelings. So let me share with you some statistics around trans folks and suicide and depression. It is incredibly startling to see this, and I'm startled every time I see it and talk about it. But 40% of trans people have attempted suicide. Not thought about it, but attempted suicide. And that's compared to about 5% of the general population. So a really big difference in how many trans folks are feeling suicidal and acting on those suicidal feelings. And once again, you know, trans people are not born to necessarily be more depressed or suicidal than anyone else. But there are systems in place that create a culture of challenge. So that, you know, may lead to discrimination, may lead to violence, may lead to health disparities, may lead to a lack of access to mental health care, physical health care, social services. And those daily struggles of living in a world that's anti-trans, that's not welcoming and not embracing of the full range of diversity of who we all are, that can lead folks to feel awfully depressed and oftentimes suicidal. We also know that trans people for a very, very long time in our country have been pathologized, and trans people are still in places like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The diagnosis has changed, but there's still a diagnosis that's related to transness. So that very fact of being pathologized doesn't help folks feel less depressed or less suicidal. So again, just a reminder, and I've used the word systemic a dozen times already, but there are systemic harms that come from some of these things that we just talked about. And there's intersectionality with all of the things that we just talked about too. So a trans person who is a person of color may experience more or different types of struggles and challenges than someone who's trans and white. Someone who's young and trans might experience different things than somebody who's 30 years old or 50 years old. We can look at many of those different intersections. Some of them are on the screen right now, but there are many ways that we can look at intersections and how they can increase the rates of victimization and violence by police and by others in our communities, and others of authority. So we've started to have a cultural awakening. So we've started to move towards a place where the world is getting a little bit different, or at least more aware of what's happening in our policing systems, as well as in discrimination and cultural insensitivities in our world. So this past year, I think more so than any other year in recent history, our country has witnessed a lot of police misconduct and a lot of police violence. Hardly a day goes by that I don't at least see some form of police violence, police misconduct on the news or in social media. It's really, it's everywhere if we're looking. And this year there has been a lot of effort to work towards police reform and racial justice and social justice. And again, when we look at reform and justice, we have to see this through an intersectional lens. Racial justice is tied to gender justice. Gender justice is tied to immigration justice. All of these things interact. And when we can free some people, it's going to free more of us. And I know those are trite statements, but they're really, really true. So we have to recognize too that what's happening in our culture, it goes beyond kind of a few bad apples. So we're not just looking at a few law enforcement officers that are acting out. We're looking at a systemic issue within law enforcement and with people in positions of power that may not be law enforcement, but might have the same types of power over people. So again, we're not just looking at, oh, if we fire this one police officer, we're good. We need to look at how do we reform the system in ways that will actually remove or resolve the issues of how law enforcement treat people, especially those who are marginalized. And again, these systems of awakening that are happening right now are really important to pay attention to. The world is watching, as the slide says. Our country is watching. People who are marginalized are watching. We're looking at things like systemic racism. We're looking at things like systemic anti-Semitism, homophobia and transphobia, systemic xenophobia, lots of systemic problems, and how we police those issues or how those issues are policed, and what the other systems of authority are that operate and are accountable or not accountable for those isms and injustices to keep on going. So when we look at the harms of policing, I'd like to ask folks in the chat again to share what are some of the harms of our current police system. What do you think some of the harms are of how our police work right now? So folks can share, so racial profiling, exactly. Reliance on force, lack of training. Mhm. Punitive, exactly. Over militarization, lack of problem solving skills, trauma inducing. Police are overburdened and not prepared. Lack of utilizing other types of first responders, unawareness of mental illness, fear inducing. People are afraid to call when they really need help. Exactly. Murder. Yeah. Physical violence to people. Yes. What else are some of the harms that can be caused? Lack of accountability. Mhm. Not enough training. Are there some other things that people are thinking about what the current harms are? Punitive attitude. Mhm. Division. Mhm. The assumption of guilt. Yeah. Ego. Hmm. Yeah, those are excellent. Mistrust. Polarity. Hmm. Permanent record. Yeah. Yeah. Those are excellent. I encourage you again to continue moving and getting your thoughts out about what may be happening. So lethal force, invasion of boundaries. Exactly. Exactly. I'm going to share with you a few of the things that you've already mentioned and potentially a few more of what some of those harms are. And again, please continue to add to the chat where you're seeing harms. So some of where at least I'm seeing harms, and I think where many of us are seeing harms, are again many of the things that you've already listed out. So that there's overt prejudice within law enforcement agencies, again, systems or individual officers. There's profiling, whether that's racial profiling, religious-based profiling, sex or gender, sexual orientation. Lots of kinds of profiling can happen. There's a lack of justice. So oftentimes people come in and then nothing ends up happening. There's no justice, whether it's criminal justice or restorative justice, there's no justice. There's no resolution to problems. So like I mentioned before, sometimes law enforcement will come when there's an intimate violence situation and they'll leave and nothing gets resolved. It's the same situation and the people are in the same spot as they were in, if not a worse spot than when law enforcement came. We can have re-victimization by law enforcement. Like I mentioned before, there could be increases in mental health distress. There could be sexual assault or physical assault by law enforcement. There can be a lot of things that happen that re-victimize people. There can be humiliation, and that can take many different forms. So if an officer mispronouns somebody, which happens 49% of the time, that can be really humiliating if there are other people that are witnessing that law enforcement interaction. That's just one example of how it can be humiliating. We talked before about verbal abuse that can happen by law enforcement, and that can be trans-specific, it can be race-specific, it can be about anything, but verbal abuse definitely is happening by law enforcement. There can be increases in mental health distress. So just the interaction with law enforcement can increase the distress, but also no resolution to why they were called can increase mental health distress. Law enforcement have the power to non-consensually institutionalize someone. So whether or not that person is a harm to themselves or others, law enforcement do have that power. So that can be a huge fear and a huge harm that is caused by policing systems. Again, I've mentioned several times the escalation in intimate partner violence or other dynamics that can happen. I'm not sure if tasing is spelled correct. I looked it up and it's either T-A-Z or T-A-S. So, but tasing can happen and tasing can be deadly as well as just really harmful to people's bodies and psyches. As people mentioned, people can be shot. People can be physically abused or sexually assaulted. People can be incarcerated, rightly or wrongly. And we aren't going to talk about the prison industrial complex and what happens in prisons, but we know that people get arrested. Oftentimes, like I mentioned before, like walking while trans and getting arrested for just moving through the world. There can be retaliation by police. So if police are called and if something happens, they know where you live or they know where you work. And that can sometimes have some retaliatory action taken by police. And as some folks in the chat mentioned, there can be lethal force used. So people can die. And those are a lot of pretty serious harms. And I know there are many, many more that we didn't list on the screen or in the chat. And the pain of those harms is really, really deep and real. And it's real for many, many different communities, trans communities, folks of color, name the marginalized community or name the non-marginalized community. These types of harms can be really, really painful and really devastating for folks. I don't oftentimes share a lot of content about the images that are included in webinars, but this is an image that was taken here in Milwaukee of a fairly prominent trans woman. You can see the back of her head with a blonde dye, getting hugged by somebody who she really cares about because it was just such an emotional day at one of the rallies here in Milwaukee. And it just, that that bubbles up for people, and it's what people live with every day. That fear that people live with, that constant anxiety that people live with, the hopelessness that so many people live with, about not knowing if help is available or if problem solving is available. So just a reminder that these things really affect people on very deep and personal levels. So let's start to look at some alternatives to policing. And I want to remind us that there are no overnight answers. We didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to resolve issues overnight. We certainly are not going to resolve them here in an hour and a half, but we can continue to have conversations about what does it look like to find alternatives and to create alternatives to policing. So, you know, the Martin Luther King Jr. line of the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think if we believe in that, I hope if we believe in that, and if we work towards it, we can make some reform in terms of policing. So what I would like us to do next, and this is the time of, if you have access to a web browser, phone, tablet, computer, I'd love you to get ready to join in with us. We're going to do some mind mapping with the concept of alternatives to policing as the focus of that map. And so if folks haven't done mind maps before, let me just show you an example of what one is. This is one that we did a couple of months ago with community in the middle. So we're going to do it with alternatives to policing in the middle. And in the Google document that we're going to share, you can drag over squares and type in those squares or rectangles, different alternatives to policing. So we can all be contributing to this map, and you can change the colors, you can draw lines between things, you can do whatever it is that shows what some alternatives to policing are. So I am going to put in the chat box the link to the Google document. So if folks are able to access that web browser and that website, we will all look at that together. So I'm going to share my screen, and you can all go on your screens, and we are going to create this map together. Excellent. So I'm seeing that people are figuring out how to do this, which is perfect because y'all are smart. So again, you can drag any of the rectangles over, put them on a spot. You can connect things to each other. You can resize the boxes. So what are some alternatives to policing? And I'm just going to be quiet for a while people add to the map. And let's take about 5 or 10 minutes to be in this space. Y'all are doing a great job. This is excellent. And you can feel free to extend beyond the boundaries of this page. You can go as wide as you need to go if you're running out of room. So as you're continuing to add content, I encourage you to look around at what other people have added. See if that spurs your thoughts at all to add more, to maybe draw some lines or connections between concepts. Why don't we take about another 2 minutes to make those connections, add any other last thoughts. This is really excellent, folks. This is really, really excellent. So I would just like to take a moment for us to take in all of these ads and ideas that folks have generated, because there are many, many interesting things that are here, ranging from training to mental health care to domestic violence support to understanding communities, LGBT communities or other communities, more training, knowing your neighbors, decriminalizing things like homelessness, responding versus reacting, things around substance use and how we address substance use, how the media pays attention to things or not, how we listen, de-escalation training, university action, how do we utilize first responders or not. Yeah, this is really great, folks. Really great. I'm going to switch back to PowerPoint. This is really, really good. I really appreciate all these ideas, and I hope that some of this spurred some thoughts for you all about what systems could look like if it's not our traditional policing system. And hopefully you are seeing the main slide back again. Nick or someone, could you give me a yes that you can see the main slide, please?
Yep, we're good.
Thank you very much. I'm always hesitant about that. So cool, thank you. So let me share with you a few things. Again, like probably all of these things are going to be in that map that you all so beautifully created. But in case some of these things didn't get mentioned, I just wanted to share with you some of my thoughts and some of other people's much smarter than me thoughts about what we can do as alternatives to policing. So I saw some people write in the map about decriminalizing things. So can we decriminalize nearly all nonviolent crimes? So things like homelessness, things like marijuana, things like sex work, things that are not harming anybody. Can we decriminalize those things? Can we create mobile crisis response for mental health, for intimate partner violence, for substance use, many other things that we could have very specifically trained folks that are a crisis team that maybe not law enforcement, right? Maybe not, they could be law enforcement that are trained specifically, or they could be non-law enforcement people that are responding to those types of crises. Can we have some unarmed mediation and intervention teams? Again, this could be law enforcement who are unarmed or non-law enforcement who are unarmed, who work specifically with mediation and intervening at moments of crisis or distress or conflict for people. Can we look at restorative justice? Our criminal justice system doesn't work very well for the majority of people and the majority of things that we consider crimes in our culture. So what does restorative justice look like? And it's hard to look at restorative justice, but can we explore some of those avenues instead of criminal justice? What can we do in terms of community engagement and resolution? I saw many things on the map that related to this of like, how can we listen? How can we, as neighbors and community members, engage and start to resolve issues rather than calling the police? What do we need to do in terms of education? How can we help people know what healthy relationships are? How can we help people learn about valuing and respecting other people? How can we teach people about all of the things that end up leading to conflict and, again, crimes in our culture? Some of the alternatives, additional alternatives could be around mental health reform. And I think that that was mentioned many times in the mind map. And I think this is a major push in the current conversations that we're hearing a lot about, is how do we reform our mental health system so that people can actually access and receive the care that they need for their mental wellness and their wholeness. Can we have housing solutions for everyone? So, I mean, in an ideal world, we wouldn't even be looking at shelter, or we'd have housing that everybody could access, that was affordable, that was safe, that was permanent. So what can we do around housing? What can we do around a livable wage so that people don't end up homeless or don't end up depressed or suicidal? How can we increase people's viability in an economic way, so that there's more baseline to live from? Can we do things like forgive student loans? And again, should all higher education be free? Probably many of you on this call today would say yes to that. And there's certainly many folks in Congress that think that as well. So how can we do that? Because those kinds of reform add to criminal justice reform, police reform, and make the world a better place. I saw many of the next pieces on the map as well, which is like, how do we engage with community groups or organizations that might be the better people to serve particular populations? So what about faith-based organizations or institutions? How can they support folks, whether it's around homelessness or around love and care for people, respect for people, feeding? How can LGBT community centers help and support people? How can campuses support people in ways that maybe are not happening elsewhere? How can campuses provide more services for students that create a whole and welcoming environment that addresses the needs that students are having, even those tough needs that the schools sometimes think are not their business? What can we do in K through 12 schools to change cultures of bullying, how we talk about respect, what people learn beyond basic reading, basic writing, all of those things that are required? Can we require and encourage schools to also embody some of those healthy relationships and healthy skills? And can we have other kinds of skills-based organizations? So if somebody does drop out of high school, can they access a GED program? Can they access money management? Can they access things like learning a trade or a job that can help them with resilience? I know all of those things are kind of about money and jobs, but there are many other skills that may help to create people's sense of wholeness and wellness, reducing crime, reducing policing, and all of those things. So many of those things and many more, maybe some alternatives to policing when we provide people with the resources that they need. I'm going to share basically only one resource with you all. We could talk about a lot of different resources, but this website that's called don'tcallthepolice.com is really fantastic. It doesn't have a lot of like blog type content on it, but it has a state-by-state listing of who you can call, not the police, around housing, around LGBTQ issues, around mental health, around domestic violence and sexual assault, around youth, around elders, around crime, around substance use. And there's many more categories, but it goes state by state. So you can look at your state and say, who can I call if I see my neighbor is in distress, and they're having a mental health breakdown? What can I do if I see somebody who's, lying in the park and they're shivering and they're cold because it's winter in the Midwest, and they need housing? Who can I call? Do I call the cops? No. Let me see if I can find a housing resource that I can call instead. So I really encourage folks to take a look at this website, and it will, I'm sure it will spark some ideas and give you some concrete resources of who you can call instead of the police. One of the things that is listed on this particular website is this 4-point, kind of impossible to read on the screen, system of questions about pausing before you should call the police. And I'd just like to go through these 4 things quickly, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So pause before you call the police. So the first question is this merely an inconvenience to me? Can I put up with this and be okay? So is somebody playing loud music next door? Did somebody just run across your yard? Did some other dog poop in your yard? Is it an inconvenience? Can I live with it? If the answer is yes, you identified that police do not need to be involved. Number 2, before you call the police, can I handle this situation on my own? Is this something I could talk out with the person involved? So if the answer is yes, you can handle the situation. So no calling the cops, you can handle it. Question 3, kind of pausing before you call the police. Is there a friend or a neighbor or someone else that you could call to help? And so that might be in situations that are a little more challenging, that you might not be able to either ignore or handle on your own. And if the answer is yes, you and your community handled the situation. The 4th pause is, could we use mediation to talk through this problem? Could I contact an alternative emergency response line? So this might be somebody who's severely suicidal, and you may not have the skills to address it other than being there to listen, and listening goes a long way. But maybe you can be there with that person while you call a suicide hotline, for example. So that's not really mediation, but it's using somebody else, calling somebody else other than the police to help mediate or resolve the crisis at hand. So if the answer is yes, that you could use some additional support, you helped your community handle the situation. So those are just a few things to think about for us before we make that call to 911 or engage the police. So I just wanted to share with you again our website, which has been on every single one of the slides. We don't have a lot about police on our website because we tend to not encourage folks to call the police, but there are many trans-specific resources, many sexual assault, intimate partner violence resources on our website, both for providers and for trans community members. I want to remind folks too that we would love to connect with you on social media, and you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So I appreciate everybody sticking with us to this point, and I would love to have some conversation or some questions or comments. I know we do have quite a bit of time left, so I'm open and game. So
Yeah, Michael, we've got some questions that some of the folks who are participating today submitted. One question is, how do you know what to call a person by the correct thing unless they tell you? So not sure why someone should get so upset if someone has never met that person and does not know how to address them.
that's a really good question. So our recommendation is to, if law enforcement is coming, because I'm presuming that was around the law enforcement is coming in mispronouncing somebody. You're correct that when we meet somebody, we don't know what their name is. We don't know what their pronoun is until we have a conversation with them. So, I strongly encourage when I train law enforcement to, if they're walking up to a car at a traffic stop, say, I'm officer so-and-so. I use he, him, and his pronouns. Can I have your name and your pronouns? So we want to ask people what their name is. We want to ask what their pronouns are, and then we want to use those name and those pronouns. So an officer might then come back and say, can I see your driver's license? And if that driver's license is not congruent with what that person says, the officer can say, hey, I see that there's a difference between the name that you gave me, or this picture looks, not like what you look like, and that's a tricky road to go down. But they can ask for clarification, and the person can choose to say, well, yeah, I'm trans, or yes, this is my driver's license and it's valid, and I'm transitioning from male to female, or they can say whatever it is to give that officer the heads up, as well as stating what their pronouns are. Does that answer some of the question? It's a really good question.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for that answer. There's a couple more questions that we received from the chat. The next one is, if harsh treatment from police is systemic, then would the treatment from police diminish if sex work was legalized?
That is a really good question. Some people certainly think that when things like sex work are decriminalized, things like small drug, I'm losing my words, but like having small amounts of drugs on your person is decriminalized. Those kinds of things that are doing no harm to people, if those things are decriminalized, people will have less contact with police, and less harm from police. So there's a lot of push for decriminalizing a bunch of things that don't cause direct harm from people. So, we're not talking about people who are engaging in physical violence or robbery or things that are causing harm. So yeah, I think the answer is yes to that.
Thank you. And the last question that I had submitted from the chat relates to a specific circumstance, and there's some additional questions coming in. Yeah, feel free to send additional questions. This question is, if a person with mental health concerns is threatening people with a deadly weapon such as a knife or a gun, who do you call in that instance?
That is hard. I'm not gonna take a cop out answer, but I'm gonna remind folks that this is not exactly my area of expertise, but knowing what we know, um, I think people need to be careful for their own safety, right? If this person with a knife or gun is close to you, you need to make sure that you're safe, and try to, do something that's going to minimize that person from harming other people or harming themselves. So, I don't want to say that calling the police is the answer, but that might be the answer in that specific situation. If it's somebody, maybe I'm going to just play off of this for a second. If it's somebody maybe that's in your household that and they've brought out their gun and are threatening suicide or saying something like that, there may be an opportunity to engage in conversation with that person, but that's going to be at your own feeling of safety. Calling the police is not necessarily going to get them there quickly enough. And unfortunately, a lot of times calling the police does end up with somebody dying when somebody has a weapon. So I think there's some risks of who has the weapon, who's called, how to work through that, what that person is doing with the gun or the knife, if conversation can happen or not. And that's a really bad answer. And I don't know if there's a good answer to it. And I would be curious if other people want to add in chat or can be unmuted if you have some different thoughts on that.
Thanks, Michael. There's one other question that's come in, and yes, as Michael said, feel free to share your thoughts on that last question in the chat, or um, over voice, as you see fit. This question is another sort of circumstantial question. Are there alternatives to calling 911 if a person is reacting poorly to taking illicit drugs? This is an instance where I could see it being harmful to call 911, but if the person is having a medical emergency, I don't know what other number we should call.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So again, like let me play out a couple of situations. Let's say somebody in your neighborhood, you're walking your dog and you see somebody who might be having a drug overdose. This is basically about drug overdose. Is that correct? Like having an extreme reaction
That's my
to
understanding, yes.
drugs? Okay. And I think this is true for drugs that are considered legal or drugs that are considered illegal. If somebody's having a drug interaction or a drug reaction, calling the police is one, one possibility. But if the police are called, they definitely need to be informed that there's a medical emergency so that ambulances get called, not just police. But the other thing is, if this is a neighbor that or you feel comfortable with, can you take them to the hospital? And I know there's some risk in that, but can you get them to the hospital or get them medical care without involving the police? Some people may want you to call the police, and that's an option too. If they're conscious and they're able to respond, you can say, "Hey, I'm concerned about you. Can I call you an ambulance?" And that might disarm the situation. Sorry about the bad language there, but to remind that person that you're calling to get them medical care so their emotions don't escalate around having the cops called. And that's a difficult situation again.
Sure. Thank you. Another question. You had mentioned the changes, the alternatives to policing. The question is, what are some ways that we can encourage these changes in our communities?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that when we're looking at like campuses, for example, there's a lot of discussion on campuses. There's a lot of discussions at faith communities. A lot of discussions are happening around police reform, social justice, racial justice, gender justice. Having those conversations, starting a conversation in an organized way, like here, let's have a meeting about this, a Zoom meeting for right now. Or can we have a conversation when somebody brings up something in a one-on-one conversation? How can we bring up some alternatives or try to dismantle things like racism, sexism, transphobia, those types of things? Because when we dismantle some of those things, the police reform is going to happen in part because of that dismantling of those systems of oppression and prejudice and harm. So I think that having conversations, and that can look a lot of different ways. We're all different kinds of people and we all have different ways that we like to engage with folks. I would certainly encourage people like professors to have, components of their class, no matter what they're teaching, have a conversation about what police reform looks like. What does racial justice look like? What do all of those things look like? Whether that's an English lit class and a book that's read, or if it's a history class, or if it's a music class, how can we bring that conversation up in the work that we're doing? So that was a rambling answer, but I think there's always an opportunity for us to bring up conversations and to encourage other people to bring up those conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is another question. How do you change the legal system to be sensitive to the fact that victims may not be forthcoming due to their safety concerns?
Yeah, that's a huge question. I really appreciate the question. I think it goes back to the mind mapping that we were doing about where is their training? Can we try to reform some of the legal systems to be more sensitive? Again, just like law enforcement, the cops on the street have protocols to use. Our legal systems are the same way. There's a lot of protocols and a lot of systems that don't mesh well with people that don't trust those systems, and for good reasons don't trust those systems. I think that my answer is kind of mixed, because I think that training is part of it. We aren't going to get rid of that justice system overnight. But I think that more and more people are looking at what does transformative justice look like? What does community justice look like? What does community communication look like? And there might be some resolutions that happen in those ways rather than going through legal systems. Now, that may not end up with the kind of justice that somebody wants, but a lot of the times the people that don't trust the legal system are not going to enter into that voluntarily anyway. Again, not a great answer. There's not great answers to some of these questions, and I very deeply appreciate the question. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for your answers, and thanks to everyone for asking those questions. There are some additional questions, Michael, that you may be able to see in the chat. Some folks are posing them there for everyone. So in some of the time that we have left, if you want to take a look at those and address those, that would be fantastic. Thanks.
Can you call out some of them, since it's
Sure.
oftentimes
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah. Happy to do that. Yeah. There's a question. Where can we find information about hiring minorities for farm work specifically? As you know, one of the colleges presenting is the College of Agriculture. So that is a question pertinent to many of us.
That's not a question to me. So, I mean, well, it's not a direct question to me.
Okay.
I would love it if other people have answers to that.
Yeah.
Because...
So feel free to jump in with answers in the chat as folks have had experience with that. Another question: how do we enact wide sweeping change when there are so many different types of law enforcement agencies and when policing is handled at the local level?
Yeah, that's a challenge too. So I'm going to answer all these questions kind of in the same way, which is like, these are really hard questions, and they're questions that we don't have answers to. And I think that I'm hopeful that I don't want to be partisan, but I'm hopeful that some of the changes we've already seen in this first week of President Biden's being president, and some of the work that he's already done around racial justice, and that we've just had a little tip of the iceberg on this. I'm hoping that some of it has some top-down approaches that can be felt at the more local levels. It is difficult, especially in smaller communities and rural communities, where law enforcement may not have access to the wide range of diversity training that like New York City or Chicago or some of the larger cities have. So it becomes really difficult and different. And on the other hand, I've done a fair amount of training with law enforcement, which can be difficult, but I find that sometimes those local communities, especially those local rural communities, people know each other in those communities and are more likely to treat each other with respect than folks sometimes in bigger cities, even if those bigger cities have had more training, because people are more anonymous in those bigger cities. So I think, like you wrote in the question, there are different types of agencies. And I think that how we train those agencies, how we introduce information to those agencies, and those different types of law enforcement is going to look different. So that makes our jobs as trainers more difficult, our jobs as community members more difficult. But if you live in a rural area, for example, and someone is law enforcement, whether they're volunteer or they're paid law enforcement, is there conversation that you can have? Or is there hey, have you watched this TV show and it happens to be about trans folks? And I'm not trying to dumb it down to like watching a TV show, but like having those conversations with people as people can really make a difference, even if they're not being officially trained. That was a long-winded answer for it's hard, it does look different, and there are ways that we can train folks in different ways. Thank you for the question.
Sure. Some other questions. What has the experience been like in your instance or others that you've known training police officers about trans awareness?
Yeah, good question. I have done, again, a fair amount of training with law enforcement. One of the things that it seems like is widely accepted is that law enforcement like to be trained by other law enforcement. So I know when I'm entering a place to train law enforcement that I'm going to be less credible than if I was a fellow law enforcement officer. So one of the things that I've done in the past is to train with a law enforcement officer. There's a lot of LGBT liaisons that are police across the country. And so sometimes it's helpful to co-train with someone else that's in law enforcement. It makes it more credible, it makes it more believable. And it is sometimes difficult because sometimes there are some older school beliefs that some law enforcement have, especially if they've been on the force for 20 or 30 years. And I don't mean that to be an ageist thing, but I think that people get set in what they know. and they don't always learn new things. So we're seeing that some of the younger officers that are coming on law enforcement agencies may be a little bit more open to talking about gender justice, about trans issues, around queer issues, around the things that we're talking about today. So I'm not putting it on the younger officers, but I think that the change is coming from within, and the change also needs to come in terms of how we approach training. Just one last comment about training police. One thing that I find is I tend to be really interactive in specifically in in-person trainings. And I found that law enforcement like to be told, like, here's what to do, number one, number two, number three. So when I'm training with law enforcement, I have found to be very effective when I list out, here's what you should do, here's what you shouldn't do, and give them practical examples of what they can and can't do, rather than saying, well, let's think about this, or let's talk about it, or let's have dialogue. Dialogue is important, but I think that it sinks in better when there's a 1, 2, 3, here's what you can do. Again, long answer. Thank you for the question. That's good.
Thanks, Michael. There's another question, and again, this pertains to probably a broader policy question, and again, maybe the difficulty too of enacting at the local level. The question is there a way to get rental companies to stop raising rent so that people do not end up homeless?
Yeah.
Obviously, that's a concern right now too, amid a pandemic, with an external pressure on that.
Yes, exactly. And I think that I mean, what you just said is really really true. And I think this is it. It's a really, really great question, and it's beyond my scope of knowledge. But yeah, I mean, it's a huge challenge. And I think that especially in some cities, rent is astronomically high, and it continues to go up. And I think oftentimes the most marginalized folks end up paying a disproportionate amount in rent if they can't get a good credit check or some of those other things. So again, that's another area I think that needs reform, and I'm hoping that can I'm hoping that changes as our world is changing. No good answer, sorry.
Thanks, Michael.
I'm just looking to see if are there any more questions that are coming in, or any comments that are coming in?
Just people thanking you for your answers and your informative presentation today, and the resources that you shared. But feel free, we do have a couple minutes left in case anyone does have any other questions.
And let me scroll to one last piece of interaction, and I'm happy to do more questions or comments as well. But I would like to kind of end today too with both thanking everybody for being here, and thank you, Nick and Ayana and Carmen and the folks that are behind the scenes today, and Sky, who's not here, for making this space to have this conversation. I really appreciate having the conversation with folks, even though it's a little bit one-sided. But I love the chat and having that opportunity to hear things from you all. A closing question that I would like to pose for people, and again, if you'd like to share in the chat, that would be super, is what is one thing that you can do today to reduce the harm that's caused by the systemic problems within our culture? So that was kind of asked in many of your questions. So I'm going to turn it back to you all and say, what is something that you can do today that's going to reduce the harm? I would love to hear what people have to offer with that. Share the website, don't call the police. Yep. On social media. Thank you. Yes. Learn about more resources, look up local policing policies in our communities. Yeah. Educate others, get to know more neighbors. Exactly. Yeah. Have conversations with people I know, and what I've learned here. Yep. Excellent. Yeah. Follow Forge on social media. Great. Thank you. Learn more about de-escalation techniques. Yes. Attend city council meetings to voice our concerns. Perfect. Be informative to others regarding other resources that can replace 911 calls. Yeah, those are really excellent. Really, really excellent. I really appreciate those ideas. And I really encourage folks to think about what you can do, because, you know, if our culture is going to change, it requires all of us to make some changes. Sometimes those changes are little minuscule changes, and sometimes they're really big changes. So really, really think about what it is that you can contribute. I'm seeing a question about where to get more involved. I would encourage you to do some Google searching about defunding the police, racial justice. Take a look at that website that was in the resources. Those are some places to start. You know, people are writing about learning about Narcan. Exactly, that I should have mentioned that. That's a really great suggestion. And I know some people on our staff have gone through Narcan training, which is fantastic. So like that's something that people can do and take positive action about. Excellent. Thank you. If you would like to reach out to me, I am happy to have further dialogue with folks. Email is the best place to reach me, but I will respond by phone too, even though my phone number is not on there. So thank you again, everybody, for being here today and for all the back end support. And I look forward to potentially more conversations with folks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you all for joining us. This was a great presentation. I learned a lot. I will be sharing that Don't Call the Police website on my social media, so that is great. Just want to let everyone know that we will be having another session tomorrow. We'll be talking about BIPOC farmers and sustainable agriculture. So we hope to see you tomorrow. We'll have another wonderful panel of people talking about some of these different intersections. So thank you all for joining us and have a wonderful day. If you have any questions or anything, please feel free to send an email to me or Nick or Carmen. Also, we'll be sending out a link for a Qualtrics survey. We want to get some information, get some feedback on how things are going. So please, when you get that, please fill it out. We know people don't like to do it, but if you could do that, that would be great. So thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, y'all.